therefore indeed funded by the Wellcome, but he collaborates with the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, gets more incestuous as we go along, and your main field is neurobiological mechanisms underlying psychiatric symptoms. But you say you are, on your website or on your Twitter account, you're a Bayesian radical or a Bayesian something.
I'm a Bayesian hypocrite.
A Bayesian hypocrite, good. Explain, well, I know what a hypocrite is, but explain what that means before you go
Can I
further.
explain it at the end of the talk?
All right.
Okay.
All right.
I promise
okay.
I'll explain it at the end of the talk. Thank you, Simon. All right.
Are you going to sing?
No, that would be best for no one. Okay, so thank you very much for the somewhat generous introduction. Thank you very much for the Sainsbury, Gatsby, and Wellcome Trust for putting this on, and for putting together this amazing initiative in psychiatry education, which is really incredibly important and similar to other speakers, I feel like is really long overdue. So I've been given a brief to talk about something called computational psychiatry. So, whoops, let me see if I can figure this out. Apparently, there it is. Computational psychiatry, which I'll call it CP at other points, just for brevity, towards a mathematically informed understanding of mental illness. And so this is a pretty big title, and I'm afraid to say that I can't possibly cover everything in this field, relatively new field, in the time allotted. I'll try and give you a taster of the kinds of things that are going on. But I think it's a really exciting area. It's quite small at the moment. Not that many labs have got the capability to do this kind of work. But I think in the same way as brain imaging sort of came in the mid-90s and sort of took over everything, I actually think computational psychiatry will probably undergo something of an explosion over the next 10 years. And in some ways, this talk is sort of an advocacy talk to actually suggest that we put some of this stuff in the curriculum. Just like Ed was saying, I think it's really important that we have better quantitative training for psychiatry trainees, so that at least be able to understand some of this stuff. Okay, so let's just start off by addressing the kind of basic question, what the computational psychiatry actually is. So I'm going to define it as the use of mathematical and computational approaches to address questions relating to mental illness, and that's a very broad description. However, you might think, well, what sort of questions are we interested in? What sort of data are we interested in? What kind of levels of explanation are we interested in? And I would say that computational psychiatry can incorporate all levels, all different types of questions, and all different types of data. So it really depends on the type of question that you want to ask in relation to the type of data or level of explanation that you're going to provide. But essentially, if you can build a mathematical model to try and explain some kind of feature of data within mental illness, and that could be at the biochemical level, it could be at the genetic level, very commonly now it's at the neuroscience / cognitive level, could be at the phenomenological level, then I think that's a type of computational psychiatry. So it is very broad, but most of the people who do this kind of research in the field are focusing on neuroscience / psychological approaches, and of course that's the area that we're interested in as well. So the talk is largely going to be focused on the neuroscience / cognitive mechanisms, but I don't want you to think that this is the only place where you can apply computational techniques. And broadly speaking, there's two types of research in this area, and they don't interact that much with each other, so I'm going to explain both of them separately, but in principle they can be combined. So the first one I'm going to call is data-driven, or I could call this theory agnostic, but basically it's a sort of big data approach. So it's the kind of approach where you've got a huge and rich data set, and you're trying to find hidden structure using computational methods that in some ways hidden inside that data. And as I say, that's very often agnostic to theory or knowledge. It often doesn't give us great insight into mechanism, though sometimes it does. And then the second approach, which is actually the one that my lab is more familiar with, and through collaboration with people like Ray and Peter Dyan here, we have started to develop as well in our own group, is this theory-driven approach where you basically write down a theory in mathematical form. And that enables you to be incredibly precise about what you think it is that you are saying about how the cognitive or neural process works, and then you test if that model can explain the data. But the important thing is this word generative here. So you have to write down a model that can actually generate the data that you are measuring. And so that's why it's different to descriptive statistical analysis in psychiatry. And this very often relies on Bayesian statistical methods, different to orthodox statistical methods. And so as I said, in principle, these can be combined with each other, but in practice, it's very rare for that to happen. So in the broader picture of biological psychiatry, I would say computational psychiatry fits into this idea that is kind of undergoing a revolution in the field, which is that at the moment in psychiatry, people use checklists of symptoms, such as in the DSM or the ICD, And the definition of the disorders and the diagnosis of the disorders is purely at the level of the phenomenology. And of course, we can get reasonably reliable diagnoses. One psychiatrist and another psychiatrist will probably agree that a particular patient has a particular disorder. It's very difficult on that basis, just on the basis of the symptomatic definition, to predict who's going to respond well to different types of treatment. And I actually think that is probably the next big nut to crack in terms of effects on clinical practice. If we, as computational psychiatrists, or even as biological psychiatry researchers, could provide clinicians with something that could actually help address this kind of question, what should I actually do with this particular patient, then I think we would really be making a lot of progress. And this really speaks to this question of mechanistic heterogeneity, which is that underneath these symptoms, there are probably lots of different processes going on inside the brain. And so the thing that we're particularly interested in my group, which is in motivational processing and anhedonia, as we heard a little bit about from Carl Disseroth earlier, is trying to interrogate some of these circuits and interrogate some of the cognitive mechanisms, try to relate those to the symptoms, but at the same time realize that those might be shared across different disorders. So we may well have similar looking patterns of brain activation, similar looking patterns of behavior that might tell us something about these similar kinds of symptoms of other disorders as well. And I think eventually the hope is that psychiatry will go through a sort of change in the way that it defines disorders, and at that point, and if that's done on a mechanistic basis, we actually might get to a point where we can actually get better treatment outcomes. So of course that's a very, very long way off at the moment. We're just taking the first steps. And internationally, this relates to something called the NIMH Research Domain Criteria, or RDOC, which will be familiar to many people within the room, which really tries to set this out in a very systematic fashion, just looking at different cognitive processes down here, different levels of explanation up here. And so, of course, computational psychiatry fits into this framework, but I think there's a few things missing in this diagram, and I'm going to leave it up there for a second, and people will look at it and think, what is missing from this diagram? And then I'm going to come back at the end and say what I think computational psychiatry is able to add that the RDOC hasn't so far given us. And I think that's a very, very important point, because I think it does go beyond this more general idea of moving towards a mechanistic level of definition and explanation. Before I do that, I'm going to go through some examples of the techniques. And unfortunately, we haven't done all different types of research that I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to give you other people's examples. But we'll come back to some of my own research in motivational processing towards the end. So let's start with data-driven computational psychiatry. So this is basically using standard machine learning techniques, the same kind of machine learning techniques as people like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Sainsbury's are all using in order to track your data and figure out what you like to buy and send you the right type of vouchers and for your reward card and all those kinds of things. These are techniques that have become increasingly popular over the last 10 years as computational power has got more and more impressive. And we could broadly split this approach into two types of ways of thinking about the problem. There's what I'll call supervised learning on the left here, and unsupervised learning on the right. And the difference between supervised learning and unsupervised learning is that with supervised learning, you tell the computer program what the outcomes are. So you tell the computer program, this person is a patient and this person is a control. So you've sort of imposed part of the solution on the computer program. And this is exactly the kind of thing that companies use in order to classify visual stimuli, for example. So, when your iPhone pops up and asks you, who is this person sitting here? That's because of they've trained the classifier to recognize things that are supposed to look like faces. In contrast to unsupervised learning, where it's completely blind, essentially. The computer program doesn't know anything about the kind of data that you're trying to recover, the kind of questions you're trying to ask. You just throw the data at the machine and just say, can you find some kind of classification for this in highly complex, often very rich, multidimensional data sets? Can you find clusters in the data? Can the computer program find clusters in the data even if we don't tell it anything at all? And that's potentially quite interesting from the perspective of psychiatry, because we don't necessarily think that our current labels are the right labels. We don't think we have carved nature at its joints necessarily. So it may be that supervised learning is obviously potentially quite important. Maybe we can do some kind of diagnostic procedure, but maybe the unsupervised learning is also going to be important as well. Maybe it'll teach us something that we don't yet know about how, say, different types of brain mechanisms cluster together. And so a classic example that's often used in tutorials in this area is this particular data set here, which is this geyser erupting. This is Old Faithful in Yosemite National Park, I believe. And this geyser operates on two different timescales. Sometimes you only have to wait about an hour for it to erupt. And sometimes you have to wait more like an hour and a half. And these are clearly drawn from two very different distributions. And that's, of course, due to some underlying processes within the geology. So there's a population of eruptions that happen about 90 minutes apart from each other, populations of eruptions that only happen 60 minutes apart from each other. If you feed these data into an unsupervised learning classifier, it will recover for you these two hidden, or maybe not so hidden in this case, populations. And this is just a very simplistic example. The point is we can do that in very high order data, highly rich and high dimensional data as well. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples, very recent examples of where this has been applied in psychiatry, which I think are really exciting. So the first one is an attempt to sort of the most interesting possible from the clinical perspective, I suppose, that we have at the moment. And the reason I like this study is because it's done on data that psychiatrists routinely collect or GPs will routinely collect or have access to in their own clinics. So it's using phenomenological data. It's basically using symptoms. It's using patient background, ethnic, demographic, probably some income data as well, but things that are not very difficult to measure, something that you could get a patient to complete in 10 minutes in a questionnaire. And the problem that we're trying to address here is what is causing this, changes in response to treatment. Why do some patients do well on a drug, in this case citalopram, and why do other patients not do so well? And so what they've done here is use this famous STAR-D data set, which was done in primary care probably about 10 years ago now, and got lots of patients, put them all through the same treatment course. And then some of them respond and some of them don't. They've all received exactly the same medication. And what the investigators are doing here is building a classifier from all of the data that they have that is common across all of the patients. And a lot of this is symptom-based data. Now, if you just try and do this using correlations, or just try and do this using multiple regression, it doesn't actually work particularly well. The beauty of the classifier, which I'm not going to go into the details of, is that you can essentially model the interactions between those symptoms or between the symptoms and the demographic data. And it's a little bit of a black box, but it's not too difficult to understand how it works if you're interested in this general idea. There's lots of ways of building different types of classifiers. And so what the investigators did is they highlighted the initial step, these 25 different variables that seem most important in the model. So these are the things that are contributing to people not getting better, taken at baseline. And then they build a model based on these sort of most informative features and see how well it can do in classifying patients. And the results are quite impressive, given this is just phenomenological data. So in their original training set, in the STAR-D training set, they've managed to classify 65% of the patients correctly, just on the basis of this symptom and demographic data. And interestingly, if you ask clinicians to classify, say, do I think this patient is going to get better or not, they're basically at chance. They got 49% in this particular study. So the computer program here, the classifying algorithm, has picked up some pattern data that isn't immediately obvious to the sort of naked eye of the clinician. Now, one big problem in these kinds of studies is this issue of overfitting. So if you chuck a lot of data at a classifier, it will tend to pull out esoteric aspects of that particular sample, which is basically noise, which is a process called overfitting, and then it'll just give you a solution that can't really be generalized anywhere else. So that would be quite useless. So the investigators tried to take care of this by looking at the prediction independent sample, and this independent sample was called COMED. So a completely independent sample of participants. They've been giving escitalopram instead of citalopram, but very similar kinds of drugs. And the classifier achieved 60% accuracy in that cohort. So slightly less, as you often expect, due to the overfitting problem in the original training set, but still nonetheless clearly different to something by chance. But 60% is obviously still not particularly high. Now, more interestingly, when they looked in another arm in this COMED study with venlafaxine and mirtazapine, the classifier was completely inaccurate. So this appears to be mechanistically specific. It appears to be specific to this particular type of rather selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So I've just put this in as the first example because I think it's very accessible. We've got lots of data. We can't immediately see what the patterns in the data are going to look like. It's very difficult for clinicians to predict who's going to get better, and yet we've got this classifier that seems to be able to do at least something of a reasonable job, even just based on phenomenological and demographic data. So that's the supervised learning example, because we've told the classifier these people have responded to antidepressants and these people haven't responded to antidepressants. Okay, and then the other example I want to go through is a very recent paper, Nature Medicine, which is looking at biotypes in depression. So previously we've been thinking about the clinical or symptomatic heterogeneity in depression. And now we want to start thinking about this mechanistic heterogeneity in depression. So based on what Ed has told you before, I don't need to go through a lot of this slide, but if you can just remember from his talk that you can build these connectivity matrices in the brain which tell you how each region is connected to every other region. Okay, so I'm just going to take that as read and hope that people remember it. But some regions go up and down together a lot, and some regions anti-correlate, and some regions don't have much to do with each other. So then you've got lots of data. You've got thousands and thousands of different variables in each individual participant. And then what the authors did here was sort of a semi-unsupervised approach initially. So what they tried to do is distill down this enormous data set in each individual. So they've got over 30,000 features, which are connectivity estimates between different brain regions, so hundreds of brain regions. And they did this canonical correlation analysis, looking for which connections seem to associate with anhedonia and which connections seem to associate with anxiety. And they took those as two sort of important symptom classes in depression. And then they created these two summary scores, which you can see here. So this is each of these two variables is distilling a huge amount of information into a single score, a little bit like a principal components analysis. And so now they've created these relatively independent variables, or completely independent variables actually, which are themselves associated with anxiety and depression. And then they use this and chuck this into an unsupervised learning classifier. So now they're not saying anything to the classifier about which patient has which particular label. And this is what the classifier comes up with. The classifier says the best fit to this data in terms of understanding hidden populations is not that they all come from the same population, it's actually that they come from four quite separate populations to each other. Then you can see these are coloured in different colours. So cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, cluster 4 in the different colours here. So this is a really interesting concept because it speaks to this question of mechanistic heterogeneity. This is actually sort of evidence for the mechanistic heterogeneity because the evidence is suggesting, the statistical evidence, is that these patients over here are really not very similar in terms of the pattern of their brain connectivity to these patients over here and these patients over here. They live in separate populations, and a single population does a bad job of explaining this distribution. Okay, so the next thing they tried to do was actually now interrogate these different connectivity subtypes. They call them biotypes in the paper, but they're basically connectivity subtypes. And so this is biotype 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And notice at the moment, this is completely agnostic to theory. You know, they've just put in the information. They haven't told the classifier anything about the circuits that we think are important in depression, nothing about the prefrontal cortex or the amygdala or the striatum, none of this stuff. They've just told it, find the subtypes for us. And what gets pulled out is quite interesting. So in two of the subtypes, there's this frontoamygdala pattern. This is reduction in connectivity between the frontal cortex and the amygdala. That's in subtype 1 and subtype 4. And then in two of the other subtypes, an overactivation, the corticostriatal thalamic system seems to be very prominent. So that's in subtype 3 and subtype 4 as well. And you can see just sort of visually by eye, looking at these different connectivity patterns, they really do look quite different to each other. And that's because they can be reliably classified as separate on the basis of this unsupervised learning technique. And then if you now train a supervised classifier using these labels, a bit like in the last study that I showed you, and then ask it, can you discriminate this particular subclass from a group of healthy volunteers? It's very, very accurate. So this is not something that was used in the training data. They didn't include the healthy volunteers in the training data. And now they're looking, can I classify subtypes 1, type 2, 3, and 4 from this? And the classifier does a really quite good job, so about 90% discrimination. And these subtypes are very stable over time. So if you image a person at time 1 and image a person several weeks later and then see do they fall into the same biotype, they do that about 90% of the time. So the accuracy is really quite good here. And then if you use this same classifier and then apply it to a completely independent sample, so again we're sort of avoiding this problem of overfitting and esoteric aspects of the sample here, then you can still see in this independent sample with the same classifier, you still get a very, very good classification of the different types of biotypes here. So it's suggesting that these are pretty stable and pretty robustly discriminable from each other. But so far, sort of relatively interesting, hasn't told us an enormous amount we didn't already know. We're sort of pretty sure there's mechanistic heterogeneity in depression, pretty sure these corticostriatal thalamic circuits are important, pretty sure the frontoamygdala circuit's important as well. And then the final thing they did in the paper was really quite interesting. The first thing was to look at response to treatment. So one thing I didn't say at the beginning is that these patients are all from a treatment-resistant cohort. And some of these patients then underwent a TMS intervention over the prefrontal cortex, And then it turned out that the people in the first biotype were particularly likely to respond to this TMS intervention, whereas in the second and the fourth biotype, they were much less likely to respond to intervention. And this was better than the symptoms, which is important because the symptoms were involved in creating the biotypes in the first place through that canonical correlation analysis, and it also held up in an independent sample. So what has happened here is we've used an unsupervised learning technique. We've pulled out some hidden structure in the data, and that has turned out to have a clinically interesting relationship in kind of real-world practice. And then the other thing, which I actually think is in some ways the most interesting part of the paper, is that they then look to see how much these biotypes are shared across different disorders, because one of the assumptions of this new approach and mechanistic approach in psychiatry is that we should be able to find shared features across different disorders, even though the symptoms look very different to each other. And so they use generalized anxiety disorder and schizophrenia. So if they try to apply this classifier to generalized anxiety disorder patients, about 40% of the GAD patients, none of whom had a clinical diagnosis of depression, were actually classified as living in this biotype 4 here. And then another 20% of them were classified as living in this biotype 1 here. And only about 30% of them are viewed by the classifier as having a distinct biotype, so distinct from any of these other 4. So this speaks to this probable mechanistic overlap between generalized anxiety disorder and depression, even though none of these patients are actually depressed. And you might think, well, this is going to work whatever you do, bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever. But actually, it doesn't work if you do it in schizophrenia. So when you try and classify patients with schizophrenia, actually, the classifier says, no, none of these patients really look like they have a depression-type mechanistic phenotype. Their brain connectivity patterns really don't look very much like any of these other 4, and the classifier is going to classify them as something completely different. So again, this is interesting because it speaks to this question of mechanistic heterogeneity and shared mechanism across different disorders, and I think actually provides direct evidence of that, probably some of the most convincing direct evidence I've seen for that concept. Okay, so I'm going slightly fast because I've got a lot to get through, but I hope that was relatively clear. So that's the classification part of the talk finished. We did the unsupervised learning, the supervised learning first, and then the unsupervised learning. And I think they've both taught us something actually quite interesting that we didn't know before. So now I want to move on to theory-driven computational psychiatry, which is actually the kind of research that we do in my own group. And I would define the theory-driven computational psychiatry as using existing knowledge or theory to specify and test mathematically precise hypotheses, either about how the brain is working or about how people's cognitive processes are working. And of course, some of the data that Ed presented earlier very much fits into this framework. It's based on a working model in Ed's case, graph theory, about how some of these data are actually generated. And so I'm going to give you sort of a run-through about how this works in practice. And it's rather sort of mathematically or conceptually involved, I suppose. So I'll do my best to keep it as clear as possible. So there are basically 4 steps as I think about it. First, you have to write down what your model is. This is one of the things I like about computational psychiatry. It forces you to be precise in your hypotheses. If you can't write it down as a mathematical statement, then it's not going to do you any good. You're not going to be able to test it using a mathematical approach. So the model specification is basically a statement about the processes that have generated the observed data. And importantly, very often these processes are not directly observable. They're only interpretable in the context of the model. So this is what we call a generative model. And then you're going to fit this model, which has got a number of parameters associated with it, and adjust those parameters so that it can best explain the data that you have actually observed. So this is the model fitting or model estimation stage. Then often you're going to consider other models as well. You might consider a null model to check you're better than chance. You might consider an alternative explanatory model, which has got different types of parameters in it. And then you're going to trade the explanatory power of the model, so how much data it can explain, against the complexity of the model to identify what is called the most parsimonious, or normally we call it the winning model. And not everybody does this actually, but I think it's a very, very important step. And the principle here is like Occam's razor. If you've got two models that can explain the data equally well, and one of them is more complicated than the other one, then you're probably going to take the more simple one as your preferred solution. And then very often in this process, we get to the stage we're not particularly happy with our data, with our model and how it explains the data. So then we need to test the model. We need to generate surrogate data, so get the model to actually generate some data and see how well that fits either the data that we've observed or how we would expect it to behave. And sometimes that will give us insights into missing components of the model. So I know conceptually this is lots of things taken all at the same time, so I think an example is often the best way of thinking about this. So let us say you have access to your bank account, but you can't see any of the transactions that are going in and out. All you can see is the total amount of money that's sitting in your bank account and how that is changing over time. So There are a number of things that could be happening in your bank account, right? You could be getting a regular payment in, someone could be paying you a salary, for example. And you could be getting interest every month. Well, not so much nowadays, but in the olden days, you could be getting interest every month on your savings. And that would essentially, in this case, serve as your mathematical model. You could build a model of why the amount of money in my account is going up according to two parameters. What is the interest rate, and how much money is someone paying in every single month? So that would be your mathematical specification of the model. You could write down, probably most people in the room could write down a statement of why the money is going up in your account every month. Then you would estimate the model, and this basically moves the parameters around, the amount of money that's going in and the interest rate, until you find the best fit to the data. And in this case, it should be a perfect solution, assuming these are the only two parameters in play. You should be able to figure out, just from the data that you're seeing, what the interest rate is and how much money is going in every month. You should be able to find a pair of parameters there that explain the data perfectly if those are the only two influences. But it may be that there's some sneaky person taking a little bit of money out of your account every month as well. And you might want to be able to detect that. So if your model didn't fit perfectly, if you couldn't get a decent fit, then you might then test another model which had another parameter, which is a parameter about how much money someone's taking out, unbeknownst to me, every month of my account. And then you could compare those models, and probably the more complicated one would win if someone was really taking the money out. So even if it was more complicated, it would still win because it would provide a better explanation for the data. So the parameters here are simply mathematical constants that sit inside equations that tell you about how the data is behaving. So it's a very straightforward concept, I think. And if it's not straightforward, then just think back to the interest and money in and money out example, because we should all be able to build a model of why our money is going up or down in our account. Okay, so there's then two types of inferences that we can make. We can think about the parameters of the model, which are those things that govern its behavior, or we can think about the structure. And I think both of those two things are important. It may be that we live in a continuous world, like we often think about in depression, anxiety, for example. There's continuously variable symptoms in the population. But it might be that it's not just a question of the parameters. It might be the model is actually completely different. The brain is actually performing the computations in a completely different type of way. And that would be a difference in model structure. And so both of those things are valid bases of inference in computational psychiatry. And of course, I couldn't give this talk without acknowledging, as we've already heard today, the Brain Prize awarded to Wolfram Schultz and Ray Dolan and Peter Dyan, sitting in this room, because they came up with one of the first sort of really established bits of computational neuroscience that's then subsequently been extremely influential in psychiatry and showed that the brain does actually engage in exactly these kinds of computations. And this is the idea of the prediction error. And this, of course, is the work that they were awarded the Brain Prize for, initially done in monkeys and then with Ray's contribution later in humans. And so the prediction error is a very straightforward thing to understand. And this is sort of hidden quantity here. This is the kind of thing that you can't measure directly if you don't have a model. And this is why the model is useful. And the prediction error is simply what you expected, what you got minus what you expected. So you'll get a positive prediction error if something nice happens to you unexpectedly. So this is the burst of brain dopamine neurons here in this very famous figure from the 1997 paper. Actually, I discovered published 20 years ago this month. And this is the unexpected reward. So that's a little bit like winning a prize or winning the lottery. But if it's fully predicted, then you don't get a prediction error and you don't get a firing of the brain's dopamine neurons. And that's a sort of boring scenario. That's a bit like getting paid your salary at the end of the month. It's not very exciting when you see the money coming in because you're fully expecting that. And then, of course, you can also get a negative prediction error. This is when HR messes up and forget to send you your salary at the end of the month, and you're expecting to get a reward at the end of the, expecting this money, but actually it doesn't come in, and then you get a negative prediction error. So better than expected, as expected, and worse than expected. So the basic concept of prediction error. But if you don't have the value, so if you don't have the expectation, which in this case is the value, you can't actually compute the prediction error. And to get the value, of course, you need a computational model sitting behind it. And so because this concept of prediction error had been shown to be tied to the brain's dopamine neurons, that was then subsequently very, very influential in studies in computational psychiatry. So, I forgot to say one thing. Now, during learning, the prediction error is supposed to play the role of a teaching signal. So it teaches you when your expectations is mismatched with the environment. But the degree to which you learn is governed by one of these parameters that I've been talking about. And in this case, it's in red. So in general, I'm going to write parameters in red and not directly observable quantities in green. So the learning rate, which can be between 0 and 1, is how much attention you pay to the prediction error, how much it influences your values. If it's very high, then you'll tend to update your values very quickly. You'll learn very quickly. If it's very low, then you won't pay much attention to these discrepancies that are signaled by the prediction error. And this learning rate is a very important quantity. Okay, so we can use these kinds of models to try and figure out how people are making choices in the world, and then also, of course, apply these to psychiatric populations and look at things like individual differences. So I'm just going to give you an example now. It's a very toy example of different types of models and how we would then decide between them. So let us say we have to make a decision. Do you want to have ice cream or fruit salad for dinner? A question I'm going to have to answer tonight when I go and visit my mum for dinner. And if you want ice cream, if you like ice cream like me, and you generally like ice cream, and if you don't like fruit salad and you just generally don't like fruit salad, probably you're going to make a deterministic choice. And this is a model that's free. It doesn't have any free parameters in it. Okay, so a very simple model. I will always choose ice cream. And the next model is, well, I generally like ice cream, but sometimes my choices are a bit random. Sometimes I will just randomly go for the fruit salad instead, just for no particular reason. It's just a general randomness in my choice. And so then I can look at the equation like this, and I can say, well, it's not deterministic, which is this statement here. It's actually probabilistic, and I've got a rule that governs how random I am, and a parameter that governs how random I am going to be in my choice. And in this case, that's called beta, a very common parameter in computational models. Then that might just be fixed preferences or fixed values, but then I might always also learn my values over time. So if last time I had ice cream, it wasn't very nice, next time I'm going to downweight my value of the ice cream, and that's going to feed into my choice as well. Maybe I'll make it more likely for me to pick the fruit salad. Then that could be expressed by model 3. But maybe my choice is still pretty deterministic, because as long as ice cream is a bit better than fruit salad, I'll still go for it. And then the final model, the most complex model, which is the one that we tend to kind of implement in these kinds of tasks, is that you do this learning on the basis of previous experience, and you also have a certain amount of randomness in your choice. And so you can see the roles that the different parameters play here. You've got the alpha, which is teaching you how much to update your values, and the beta, which is telling you how random or deterministic to be in your choice. And then, typically what we would do is run the model, see what predictions it made about the data, try and fit the best parameters, compare the models and the model evidence between them, pick the one that fit best, generate some surrogate data and see how well we could recapitulate the original data. And this is basically the process of deciding which model to win. And normally, in these kinds of experiments, model 4 is going to win. Okay, so that's just kind of walk through about the kinds of things that you would do. And of course, the most complicated bit is actually fitting the model, jiggling about the parameters so that you get the best fit to the data. And so this exact approach has been used in several studies in computational psychiatry to try and gain insights into anhedonia, which is a particular interest of mine. So this is a reward bias task developed by Diego Pizzagalli. And it's very simple. All you have to do is say whether you think there's a long face, long mouth, or a short mouth on this face. But unbeknownst to you, sometimes if you get it right, you're going to get rewarded, and that'll happen more often if it's long than if it's short. So this is called the rich stimulus, and the short one then is called the lean stimulus by Diego. And what people do over time is, because they obviously gradually learn that the long one is nicer than the short one, they'll tend to respond long more of the time. So they develop this bias to responding to the long stimulus. And interestingly, in several studies, patients with depression are shown not to show this kind of behavior. So they don't show such a pronounced response bias. So that's the basic effect. Now, from a mechanistic or computational point of view, at the moment, we just don't know what is driving this behavior. It could be learning. It could be just that the patients with depression just don't update their values as quickly, and so they don't learn that the long one's better than the short one. Or it could be the valuation. It could be that they don't value the outcome as much or discriminate between the two different outcomes. And those are completely different components of the model here. And so that's what the computational psychiatry approach can tell you when you're analysing behavioural data. And so they fit various different models. I'm not going to go into them because they're rather complicated. They take the best fitting model, which in this case is the one that has the lowest Bayes factor, which is the statistic that comes out of Bayesian analysis. They recapitulate some of the data to show that it does a good job of explaining what we're expecting to see. So you get a nice tight fit from the model predictions to the data. And then they look at the parameters. So now you can extract the parameters, so extract the reward valuation or sensitivity parameter, extract the learning rate, and see how those relate to the different symptoms. And this is what they found. Basically, this is a relationship between the reward sensitivity parameter and anhedonic depression scores in the sample. but they didn't see such a relationship with the learning rate. And then if they do an inference using model comparison, this is the relative model evidence for a model that has different parameters for the two groups for the reward sensitivity, or different parameters for different learning rates for the two groups. Then you can see that in the depressed samples here, the models that tend to win are the ones that split the reward sensitivity parameter across the two groups, so allowing them to vary separately. So this is sort of bolstering this conclusion here. But very interestingly, if you give pramipexole, which superficially has a very similar looking effect on the actual behavior, the effect is in the other direction. It really seems to affect the learning rate. So this is quite interesting because it's showing us how the same pattern behavior can arise for completely different reasons inside the computational model. And it's also suggesting to us that pramipexole is probably not the best treatment for depression here because it's hitting the wrong parameter in the model. You would want a treatment that was actually going to hit the reward sensitivity parameter, not hit the learning rate. Okay, just see how I'm doing for time. Oh, not too bad. Thank you very much for giving me 5 minutes. Okay, well, I want to leave some time for questions at the end. And so finally, I'll be able to come to some of our own research, which has also used this computational approach, but doing this in the context of neuroimaging. And of course, Ray was one of the pioneers in this area of computational neuroimaging analysis. So here, what we're trying to do is answer the question about the habenula, which we've heard a bit about before in animal models, so both in zebrafish and a huge amount of data in rodents, suggesting that the habenula seems hyperactive in animal models of depression, like learned helplessness and the forced swim test, and several other different models as well. But this had never been directly tested in humans, so we used a computational approach to interrogate our neuroimaging data this time, as opposed to the behavioral data, to look to see if we could establish whether this was the case. And it's a very straightforward idea. It's just a passive Pavlovian conditioning paradigm. You see some stimuli come up on the screen, you get some outcomes, in this case nasty electric shocks, and these are probabilistically associated, and gradually you learn over the course of the experiment which ones are nice and which ones are nasty. And I won't go into the details of the behavior of this experiment, but suffice it to say, people are fully able to learn this kind of experiment. They don't actually have to do very much in the experiment. They don't make any choices. They're just sitting there learning. So if we ask them which stimuli they prefer, they don't like the electric shocks. They respond more slowly to the electric shocks. They show pupil responses to the electric shocks. They really don't like the electric shocks in this experiment. Okay. Now, how do we analyze the data? Well, we could be quite simplistic here. We could just take the stimuli that were strongly associated with shock, the stimuli that less strongly associated with shock, and compare them. That would be a traditional categorical brain imaging analysis. But here we can do something a bit more sophisticated than that. Because, of course, we don't assume that people learn immediately that this particular stimulus is associated with an electric shock. That might take several trials, or maybe even tens of trials, to evolve, depending on how quickly you learn. So we can take that into account in the analysis, and that's the point. So again, we use this very straightforward computational model, something that's been around since the 1970s. We fit this model that says if you want to update your value on the current trial, so the strength of the shock association, you just take what it was on the previous trial, it just starts at 0, and then add to that the prediction error, which is the difference between the outcome and what you expected, multiplied by this weighting parameter, which is the learning rate, the same as what we saw before. And so in this case, we actually have to set the learning rate. The details don't really matter that much. But the point is that there's this equation. And then we can look at this quantity in the model. We can look to see how the values, the associative strengths, change over time. And then we can look to see how the activation in the amygdala tracks this waxing and waning of the associative value. And I've plotted an example here for a single subject and a particular set of outcomes and stimuli, how this evolves over the course of the study. And you can see sometimes there's a very strong association, sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes back up again. This is hidden information that would not be there if we just did a traditional categorical analysis. It's a way of getting a lot more out of your data, basically. And then we put that in as a predictor of the response to the actual stimulus itself. And we were very relieved to see that the habenula, which has been very reliably implicated in negative reinforcement processing in animal work, did indeed respond to the negative value, so the strength of the association with the shock. So what this bar is saying, basically, is as the association with the shock gets stronger and stronger and stronger over the course of the experiment, the habenula activates more and more and more. And we were able to show that in a first study, and then also replicate that in a second study in a group of healthy volunteers. But the really interesting thing is that from the animal data, we would have made a very strong prediction, also from the data that we presented this morning, that the habenula should be hyperactive in depression, that the habenula, which is probably sending either an escape signal or a negative reinforcement signal, should be excessively active in patients with depression, because that's what the animal model data tell us. And we saw the exact opposite of that. And we wouldn't probably have seen this if we hadn't taken a computational approach. So what this tells us, this negative going bar here in the patients with depression, is that as the association with the shock gets stronger and stronger and stronger, the activation of the habenula gets lower and lower and lower. So the opposite of what it's doing in healthy volunteers, the opposite of what it should be doing in a healthy brain, basically. This is a sort of difficult pattern to understand. There's plenty of questions left behind this. But I think the point is here that we've gleaned something extra from the data using a computational approach, and something that has actually provided really what I think is quite strong evidence directly against a prevailing theory. And it'll be very interesting to see how this pans out in future research in humans in the habenula, because this is the first study that ever actually directly investigated in human depressed patients whether the habenula is hyperactive, and it clearly isn't. Okay, so back to the RDOC. So previously I asked you what is maybe missing on this slide, and I think there are 3 things that are missing on this slide. It's very interesting. We've got this idea of different systems, which I'm prepared to sign up to, different levels of explanation. I can certainly sign up to that, individual variability. But there's one really important thing that's missing here. First, or 3, I'll say, 3 really important things are really missing here. Firstly, how do we actually do this? How do we move between this physiological and the behavioral level? That's really, really complicated to do, because then we need a model of how the changes in the physiology is actually generating the change in behavior. If you don't have a model, I would say that's extremely challenging. And so I think that's one of the things that computational psychiatry allows us to do. It actually allows us to jump between the levels. And one of the reasons it can do that is because those same parameters, the learning rate and the randomness parameter, can have exactly the same meaning at the different levels of explanation. So your learning rate parameter could be governing something like long-term potentiation at the level of the synapse. That same learning rate parameter could be controlling the strength of association over time in your choice behavior. So I think that's a really valuable aspect of computational psychiatry. It also explicitly incorporates a role for the environment. So there's no environment here, much to the chagrin of, I'm sure, many people who work with mental health patients. It's not taking into account the fact that people are living complicated lives in complicated social situations. And of course, the environment's having an enormous effect on the way that people behave. Computational psychiatry is all about the environment. It's all about modeling the interaction between the brain and the environment that the brain is living in. And I think there's a particular role here in terms of understanding the role of the social environment that's just not there in the RDOC. And thirdly, it also speaks to potential categorical differences. So of course we already have categories in psychiatry. They've been moderately useful, even though they're not based on mechanistic information. But as we saw in that biotypes paper, you can actually pull out different categories of depressed patients, not just all continuous maybe in psychiatry. And those categories don't really look like the category of schizophrenia, for example. But it provides a more rational or more informed way of actually forming what those categories are going to be, as opposed to just relying on committee definitions of checklists of symptoms. Okay, so I've got a few more slides left, 2 more slides left, sorry. Sorry.
2 slides on 2 questions.
Okay, I'll go very quickly, because I also want to say something about education, which is something I feel very passionately about. Because I think, so I said I was going to be an advocate, and I really think we should be teaching some of this quantitative stuff in psychiatry from a model-based perspective. I think there's huge benefits here, because the computational approach takes seriously the idea that the brain is a computational organ. That's what we think the brain is doing. It is doing information processing. It is responding to the environment. If we're serious about this, then we need to be able to build models of how we think the brain is doing this, how we think the cognitive systems are actually behaving. And secondly, just a practical one, as the computational techniques become increasingly popular in general neuroscience, which they will as computer power gets better and better, then it's going to be increasingly popular in psychiatry. And we need to be able to equip people to understand how these things work. And then the third benefit is that it naturally incorporates these environmental risk factors, and it's a very, very important complement to the RDOC style approach, I feel. But of course, there's lots of challenges as well. So unfortunately, computational modeling is inherently conceptually difficult, and it largely relies on a completely different statistical framework, the Bayesian statistical framework. And this is why I call myself a Bayesian hypocrite, because I don't really feel that competent in Bayesian statistics myself yet. My students, on the other hand, fantastic. But I call myself a Bayesian hypocrite because I naturally think about the frequentist orthodox statistical approach when I'm approaching a set of data. That's just the way that I've been trained. That's why I'm a hypocrite. The implementation actually requires quite a high level of mathematical understanding and computer programming ability. And I think that's going to be an important barrier unless people are really prepared to try and train themselves a bit in this. And of course, the final thing is that if we're not careful, then the enthusiasm might outstrip the degree of scientific advance if people don't understand the limitations. So, for example, the issue of overfitting, which I alluded to earlier. You can get a beautiful model fit for classification. Does it actually generalize when you move it to a different sample? There may be models that you haven't tested yet because you haven't explored different types of parameters. So you don't know, is someone taking money out of your account? You haven't even considered that, so the parameter's not in the model. And people need to validate the models through the generation of surrogate data, and not everybody always does this, and sometimes there will be important systematic differences between what we're expecting from the model and the actual data, and taking those into account is very important when you're evaluating the research from computational psychiatry. I'll just finish by briefly putting up some resources, which I'll leave up at the end, because there is now a new computational psychiatry journal. Peter Stein is the editor. There's a computational psychiatry working group. This is a relatively small field. It's quite collegial, and people meet once a month by telephone conference and watch a presentation together. There's also a sub-meeting at biological psychiatry this year. There's even now a computational psychiatry textbook. I'm going to put that up again in a minute. I just want to acknowledge, of course, the Wellcome Trust for funding my research, and my huge number of people who have influenced my thinking, several of whom are, of course, in this room, and my amazing group, many of whom can do all the computational stuff that I can't. And, of course, thank everyone for your very kind attention. I'll finish there.
Well, okay, you're allowed. Ooh, you've got time for one question.
Great.
One question. And you had a 10-minute start as well.
I was very lucky.
You were.
Thank you again to the previous speaker.
You've also been reading 10 Ways to Beat the Chairman. I recommend it to everyone. It's an absolute citation classic. Yeah.
My question is, I was wondering if it's realistic to consider a systematic collaboration between psychiatrists and computer scientists or other experts in the field of kind of mathematical modeling to promote computational psychiatry in that way?
Well, I think it has to be. I think it's mandatory, basically. We can't be expecting all psychiatrists to go out and be able to actually implement these kinds of techniques. Just in the early days of fMRI, when collaboration with the physicists was basically mandatory for anyone who wanted to do a brain imaging study. So yes, it's obviously a highly interdisciplinary field, and I just don't think there's any other way forward than that kind of collaboration.
Okay, good. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for introducing me to the Habenula, which I always thought was a song in Carmen, but apparently it's not. And we're going to hear more about it next, are we not? I have an awful feeling, David. Is that correct? I think we will. I think we will.